Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I will be sharing my time with the Honourable Member of Don Valley West. Mr. Speaker, it's an absolute honour for me to stand in the House of Commons today on behalf of the residents of my riding of Davenport to speak to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. Before I continue, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation. Mr. Speaker, earlier this week on February 14, our federal government declared a public order emergency and invoked the Emergencies Act. This was the first time this act was used since it was created in 1988. There are clear conditions set out in the Emergency Act in order for the public order emergency to be declared. The Act was invoked only after exhausting other options. It is time limited to 30 days. It is geographically targeted. It proposes measures that are reasonable and proportional to the threats they are meant to address, and they do not displace or replace provincial and territorial authorities. This was done after discussions with Cabinet and Caucus, after consultations with the premiers from all provinces and territories, and after speaking with opposition leaders. I support this decision. For almost 3 weeks now, blockades have been illegally disrupting the lives of Canadians, harming our economy and endangering public safety. The Freedom Convoy 2022 has created a critical, urgent, temporary situation that is national in scope and cannot effectively be dealt with under any other law of Canada. The blockades of the ports of entry have disrupted the transportation of crucial medicine, goods, fuel, and food to Canadians, and are causing significant adverse effects on Canada's economy, relationship with trading partners, and supply chains. These trade disruptions, the increase in criminal activity, the occupation of downtown Ottawa, the lawlessness, and the threats of violence, as well as the presence of firearms, constitute a public order emergency, an emergency that arises from threats to the security of Canada that is so serious as to be a national emergency. What may have started as a protest by truck drivers against border mandates had quickly morphed into a rallying point for anti-vaccination, anti-government, anti-authority, and white supremacist groups, with demands ranging from an end to all public health restrictions to the overthrow of an elected government. At occupations and blockades across the country, we have seen harmful, racist, violent behavior and attempts to minimize or discount the harm done to Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it was also clear that there were serious challenges and gaps to local law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law. It is clear that extraordinary measures had to be taken to keep Canadians safe, protect people's jobs, and restore confidence in our institutions. Canada, at the very core of our existence, is a country that fundamentally believes in and is governed by the rule of law. In our blood and in our soul, we believe in peace, order, and good government. Mr. Speaker, over the last 3 years, we did not see peace and order in specific parts of our nation, and especially here in Ottawa. There was a complete shutdown of key parts of Centretown due to the occupation, stopping people from going to work, stopping businesses from reopening, making people unable to carry on with their normal lives. The first week of the occupation had an unprecedented amount of noise, which caused great distress to all those living in or near the occupation. It seriously impacted the mental health of nearby Ottawa residents, a mental health that had already been fragile for many due to the unprecedented pandemic that we have all had to live through over the last couple of years. At the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario, trucker convoys blocked the bridge crossing, stopping trade from moving between the United States and Canada, a border point that sees over $400 million of trade per day. Many Canadians were temporarily laid off, and the economies of both countries impacted. But worse, our reputation as a place to do business with ease across our two borders was greatly impacted. Our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance said that the disruptions have shaken Canada's reputation as a place in which to invest and do business. She further said the world is watching us, and that our jobs, our prosperity, and our livelihoods are endangered, and we will not allow Canada's privileged trading relationship with the United States to be compromised. This was not the only border crossing that was impacted. We saw trucker blockades in Coutts, Alberta, and in Emerson, Manitoba. The impact economically is $48 million and $73 million in trade each day, respectively, and the threat exists for other border crossings across our country. And then, Mr. Speaker, and then there were the guns. In Coutts, Alberta, protesters have been charged with conspiracy to commit murder, the murder of police officers, and a large cache of guns and ammunition were seized by the RCMP. All of these actions and threats demanded that our federal government take extraordinary actions. But it's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that this act does not suspend the Charter of Rights and Freedom. In fact, the act was created to flow from and uphold the Charter. The Act's preamble explicitly states that any measures taken under the Act must be compliant with Charter rights. The invocation of the Act does not limit freedom of speech, does not limit peaceful assembly, and does not prevent people from exercising their right to protest legally. We are reinforcing the principles, values, and institutions that keep all Canadians free. Mr. Speaker, the Emergency Act also provides additional powers to stop the flow of money that has been funding these trucker blockades and occupation. Leaked data has shown that the majority of the donors, over 50%, has been coming from outside of the country, primarily the United States. When police notified GoFundMe that the funds that they were collecting were being used for unlawful purposes, the campaign was shut down. Protesters then turned to a Christian crowdfunding site called Give, Send, Go, which raised almost $11 million. In order to stop the flow of funds for these illegal blockades and occupation, the Emergency Act included 4 key financial measures. From a press release and announcement that our Deputy Prime Minister made earlier this week, we learned a lot about the details. The first of those measures is that the Act extends the scope of Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing rules to cover crowdfunding platforms and the payment processors they use. This change covers all forms of transactions, including digital assets, such as cryptocurrencies. Secondly, the order directs Canadian banks, insurance companies, and other financial service providers to temporarily cease providing financial services where the institution suspects that an account, either personal or corporate, is being used to further the blockades. The Act also enables and directs Canadian financial institutions to review the relationship with anyone involved in the illegal blockades and report the assets and related transactions of those involved to the RCMP or to CSIS. The fourth measure is it provides the federal, provincial, and territorial government institutions with new authority to share relevant information with banks and other financial service providers if the information will help put a stop to the funding of illegal blockades and illegal activities. All Canadian financial service providers will be able to immediately freeze or suspend an account of an individual or business affiliated with the blockades without a court order. All these new requirements and authorities will help mitigate the risks that Canadian financial institutions and crowdfunding platforms transact illicit funds, increasing the quality and quantity of the intelligence received by FINTRAC and allowing us to stop the flow of funding to these illegal blockades. Mr. Speaker, as I'm nearing the end of my time, it's important to highlight the safeguards and the parliamentary oversight and accountability measures contained within the Act. As was required, the government tabled the declaration of emergency so that this House could debate and decide upon the declaration. The government also tabled the orders as required before this House. The oversight this legislation gives us as parliamentarians is an important role to ensure it is acting within the law, and I take that responsibility incredibly seriously. We have seen support from a number of provinces for this action, including British Columbia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Ontario. Our federal government is conscious of the need for transparency and parliamentary oversight as we undertake this action. And in the coming days, a parliamentary committee will be struck to provide oversight while the emergency measure is in effect. As well, an inquiry into the measures used during the emergency must be initiated once the state of emergency is over. Mr. Speaker, I want to conclude by thanking the residents of my riding of Davenport who have called and written to me all this week. I appreciated hearing their thoughts and having them reach out. It is an extraordinary moment in the history of our nation, and this is an extraordinary piece of legislation. It is absolutely the responsibility of our government, of myself as a parliamentarian, to make sure that I'm explaining why it is needed, why we need to invoke this public order emergency, and why this emergency act needed to be introduced. Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question et commentaire. The honourable member for Souris Moose Mountain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her speech. And she talked a lot about how FinTrack was going to be able to try and categorize this money coming from foreign countries, yet this is the same government that can't figure out how $12 million of CERB payments were given to Canadians outside this country. But I digress. My question to the member is, she mentioned after other options. What other options? What other options were used before this was implemented? Was alternate dispute resolution? Was mediation? Was consultation? Please, can you give us at least one or two steps about what was implemented?
So I remind all members to bring it through the chair. The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for his questions. It's an important one and important for me to respond to. Our government, on numerous occasions, had offered additional resources every step of the way, not once, not twice, not three times. We also helped to assemble a table of all three levels, or helped to enable sort of a table of all three levels of policing as well. And we found as we moved on that there were a number of gaps in the ability of police to be able to act. And so that's why we introduced the Emergencies Act. Thank you.
Question et commentaire, l'honorable député de Saint-Jean.
J'écoutais le discours de ma collègue de Davenport, que j'apprécie beaucoup par ailleurs. Et ce que j'ai compris, c'est que si elle est d'accord avec le recours à la loi sur les mesures d'urgence, à la base, c'est parce qu'elle est d'accord avec la façon dont on l'applique, avec les règlements d'application qui en découlent. Mais à la base, cette loi-là, qui est exceptionnelle et qui est censée nous protéger contre l'arbitraire, doit être utilisée seulement dans des situations d'urgence lorsqu'il n'y a rien d'autre qu'on peut faire. Est-ce qu'elle n'a pas l'impression de créer un précédent si elle ne se concentre que sur l'utilisation qu'on fait de la loi plutôt que sur vraiment les critères pour y recourir?
The honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. There's two parts to the question. One is, am I satisfied with how it's being used? I think that the truth is I probably don't know all the ways it's actually being used right now, but I do have a lot of confidence that there's going to be an inquiry into the measures used during the emergency, and that inquiry has to be initiated once the state of emergency is over. In terms of it being setting a precedent, I think for me what's important, I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of how we declared this Emergency Act. I really appreciated that it was very limited. It was limited in terms of, it was time limited, it was geographically limited, and it was proportional and reasonable to...
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Lac-Saint-Louis.
Speaker, I've noticed many members say that we already had the legislative tools, yet I noticed that the province of Ontario enacted some emergency legislation. Would the member not agree that the reason that particular exceptional legislation was not sufficient is because it did not engage FinTrack and could not deputize police forces from outside Ontario?
The honourable member for Davenport.
I want to thank the honourable member for his excellent question. I would agree with him. I think that, I mentioned this in my speech, I think that we realized, and I think the police forces across the country made us realize that there were some gaps in the ability for them to be able to act. And I think tracking the money, stopping the money was one of the key elements that was missing. I think also sort of designating spaces to be able to enforce protection. I think being able to sort of enable sort of tow trucks to sort of take action, as well as the use. We've never seen being able to address the use of trucks as instruments of blockades was also a gap in our ability to be able to use existing laws. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've been reflecting all day on the very momentous occasion that this is, and the kind of debate which is lengthy, engaged, and important. And I've been listening all day and actually have found the contributions of all the members that I've agreed with or not agreed with to be actually quite helpful for me in engaging with this conversation. We don't do that often in this House. We don't have dozens of hours of debate on an issue, and we're doing that because of the singular importance of invoking this Act. Even as we engage in our debate today, Ottawa police officers, supported by local police, by Sûreté Québec, by the Ontario Provincial Police and the RCMP, are continuing to calmly, peacefully, and effectively work to free our capital city, even as it remains under siege in an illegal occupation. And to them, I say thank you. With the invocation of the Emergencies Act, police forces and other authorities are able to engage cooperatively to restore peace, order, and good governance in this city. And in fact, the act itself can trace its roots right back to that part of the Constitution Act of 1867. It's important that we do that to have police forces cooperating with the tools they need to act in an emergency situation. But what may be less apparent, and has been mentioned today, but is equally important, this act allows us to put the squeeze on foreign and non-transparent domestic funding of extremist groups at work behind this occupation to bring it to an end. And as I speak, I'm hopeful that the end is now in sight, and the end comes without incident, without injury, and certainly without loss of life. Let me be perfectly clear. All Canadians value freedom of expression and the right to demonstrate. That's a fundamental part of what it means to be Canadian. And I, as a United Church minister, have been part of many demonstrations aimed at drawing attention to important issues of social justice. And I'm sure I'll do that again in the future. But what has transpired in Ottawa and at border crossings and at a bridge over the last few weeks has not been that. Over these past 3 weeks, I've walked through the crowds gathered near Parliament. I've seen their signs. I've heard their comments. I've also been learning from them. I've learned that there are many people on the streets here who are angry. They feel left out. They feel unheard for a variety of reasons. For some, this pandemic has exacerbated other problems, economic problems, social problems, health problems. And our job is fundamentally, yes, to listen to them, to find ways to help them, to respect them. And I am committed to doing that. But their anger, their frustration have been both manipulated and exploited by extremists who are fueled by nothing more than malevolence and a complete disrespect for the values and institutions that Canadians have built and depend on.
Can I interrupt the member for just a moment? I really apologize. Can the member take his phone and maybe move it away from the microphone? Because it's impeding on the microphones. I know, I realize. I'll give you the 2 minutes, I'll give you the one. Okay, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
All right. The anger and frustration of the people on the streets, I believe, have been manipulated and exploited by extremists who are fueled by nothing more than malevolence and a complete disrespect for the values and institutions that Canadians have built and depend on. What has transpired in Ottawa over the past 3 weeks is a massive disruption that is meant to do more than disrupt traffic and make a point about vaccines or pandemic mandates. It's a manifestation led by a small group of people, fueled by anger, even hatred, aimed at subverting democracy and the rule of law. Democracy and the rule of law go hand in hand with freedom. They protect our freedom. And it's time for this illegal occupation to end. The vast majority of Canadians, I believe, understand this and agree with our government's approach. And while I respect and value the opinions of all, this is a time when I believe we need to hold up democracy, democratic institutions, the rule of law, so that freedom, indeed freedom, can be maintained. Mr. Speaker, speaking through you directly to the residents of Don Valley West, I want to thank them for taking time to write to me, to call me, including expressing concerns for my personal safety over these last few weeks. While I note the minority of people who disagree with me, I've reached the opinion the federal government is taking the right, measured, careful action in invoking this law. They've exhausted all other options and have had to act and are doing so intelligently and judiciously invoking this act. We're all tired of COVID-19. We want this pandemic to end, and we all wish that there was a final, firm timeline to set that end. But, Mr. Speaker, this is a virus. It's persistent, it's evolving. No one is able to give an exact timetable for the return to normal life. I hear the Conservatives call for the government to set a deadline for our return to normal, a so-called plan. Frankly, what is required is that we have many plans for all the contingencies that could happen with this unpredictable virus. And we do, both at the federal level and at the level of provinces and territories, have such plans. Plans to open public spaces, plans to travel more easily, plans to combat new and yet undiscovered variants, plans to ensure every person in the world, not just Canadians, are fully vaccinated. These plans are developed constantly by public servants who are following the science and advising the governments across this country. But right now, what we really need is patience, persistence, cooperation, care for our neighbors, support for frontline workers, especially in healthcare, and a following of the rule of law in this country. And the virus will be beaten, the pandemic will end, but it will end through vaccinations and public health advances and protocols, not by occupying our nation's capital, not by blockading bridges, by stopping commerce, and by stopping the freedom of other Canadians going about their daily business. Madam Speaker, more than 5.8 million people have died from COVID-19 around the world. It's pandemic. It's the enemy. The enemies are not the scientists. The enemies are not politicians. The enemies are not medical professionals. They're not public health officials. The enemy is an unpredictable, mutating, persistent virus that needs to be beaten. The virus, however, is not the only enemy that needs to be countered. The disinformation and misinformation in this pandemic has become endemic. And it saddens me that otherwise intelligent people are falling prey to that misinformation and do not see the far-right agenda which is at work in this situation. They are an opportunistic infection, if there ever was one. Fueled by paranoia, conspiracy theories, and ignorance, it's culminated in the demonstration that we are seeing in our city streets and that we've been listening to and walking through. We are hearing the hurt, we're hearing the disaffection, we're hearing the anger, but we also want them to know they are heard and should not be manipulated by extremists who have no other goal but to disrupt our freedom and democracy and the rule of law in this country. So we have the Emergencies Act to end the blockades at this time. Our Prime Minister, I believe, waited as long as he could, working hard to defuse the situation. Over the past weeks, illegal road, border, and bridge closures, significant negative impact on the economy of them, convinced him to invoke the Emergencies Act. There will be discussion about that. There will be a parliamentary committee overseeing it. There will be hearings after it is over. There will be public discourse to ensure it is done. But right now, in this House, we should be united to ensure that we remain a country of democracy, of the rule of law, and of ensuring that our fundamental freedoms are enshrined. We have the Charter of Rights. That was a Liberal bill. We have the Bill of Rights, a Conservative bill. Both of them are protected in the Emergencies Act. As the interim Ottawa Police Chief, Steve Bell, noted, right now this act is helpful, it's necessary, it's effective, and we see it working as our streets are slowly cleared. This morning I walked into this place somewhat afraid of the day ahead. I believe tonight I will go back home just a little bit more sure that Canada will remain a place where all of us are safe, all of us will have our rights and freedoms protected, and all of us will be able to engage. We'll continue to do this, Madam Speaker. We will work together, and I encourage all members of this House, all parties, to engage in this as is important to your constituents, as is important to ending this pandemic, as important to making sure Canada remains Canada. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for a very good speech. I did notice one term in there when he talked about far right far left. These are divisive terms, and I think we have to look at people that are people in here and make sure that we're actually listening to Canadian voices wherever in the spectrum they may be, and make sure that everybody gets heard in this country. Stigmatizing some of those voices, I don't think is the right approach to this, but I know he's usually not undertaking that kind of behavior. But I will ask him the question around Canada's financial system. If I pose to him that Canada already has adequate laws under FinTrack to address foreign funding coming into Canada and looking at it, would he reconsider the notion of actually stigmatizing the bank accounts of people who've donated a small amount to people they supported in these protests as they came to Ottawa when they were protests, and now they have the notion of having their bank accounts frozen as a result? Would he reconsider that at this point in time?
The honourable member, the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to be very clear. The government has absolutely no intention of stigmatizing anybody in this process. However, we're going to follow the money. And now we have the tools to follow the money and find out exactly where influence is being spread. You know, for two years, I was chair of the Public Safety Committee, and I listened to Conservatives often saying Liberals are naive. They're not following the threats. They're not following the information from intelligence agencies. Madam Speaker, we have listened. We are not naive on this side of the House. We're not playing politics. We are engaging in the most important systems that we need to engage in to ensure that this country is protected. And I believe the Conservatives know that and should get on board with it.
Commentaire, l'honorable député de Lac-Saint-Jean.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Madame la Présidente, mais je remercie mon honorable collègue pour son discours. Mais quand on veut utiliser une loi extraordinaire comme celle de la loi des mesures d'urgence, je pense qu'il faut être certain à 100% que c'est la bonne décision. Contrairement à ce que croit d'ailleurs mon collègue de Oliphant, comme il nous l'a dit plus tôt aujourd'hui, il a dit qu'il n'était pas sûr à 100% que c'était la bonne décision, mais qu'il voulait la prendre quand même. Maintenant, que dit le texte de la loi, Madame la Présidente? Il dit que tous les autres outils législatifs ordinaires doivent avoir été utilisés avant de décréter la loi sur les mesures d'urgence. Donc, ma question à mon honorable collègue, c'est est-ce qu'il croit que c'est le cas? Est-ce qu'il croit qu'on a déjà utilisé tous les outils législatifs déjà à notre disposition? Et si c'est le cas, est-ce qu'il peut nommer ces outils-là, s'il vous plaît?
The honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And nothing in life is 100% certain. I could not live if I were waiting for everything to be 100% certain. But the burden of proof, I believe, has been met, that we have exhausted, we have listened to police forces, we're giving them the tools, we are working with them to ensure our rights and freedoms are protected, but also that the authorities have the tools that they need to act. And we'll engage. We will have a public inquiry after this event. We have a parliamentary committee which will oversee it. Everything will be transparent. Everything will be acted upon, but this is a courageous act. The legislation is there. The Prime Minister and the Cabinet are using it, and frankly, I am proud of them.
We have time for a brief question. The honourable member for Nunavut.
I want to thank the member for Don Valley West. I also want to thank the parliamentary staff who have been doing an extraordinary job. I have described the leaders of the so-called Freedom Convoy as extremists. I am being asked by my constituents in Nunavut what extremists I'm talking about. Could the member describe those who have led the illegal blockades and exactly what danger they pose to the rest of Canada?
The honourable member for the honourable parliamentary secretary.
Thank you, and I want to thank the member for Nunavut today for her leadership on this issue. I've been profoundly moved by her questions, both about inclusion and about rights, and now this one. Arrests have been made. A significant number of arrests have been made yesterday and today. These folks are now before the court, so I'm not going to comment on them directly. The court processes will take place, and we will understand what happens later. It is my instinct, however, and having followed the news on this and having followed intelligence over the last number of years about who is moving and where our biggest threats are to Canada, I believe those threats are from extremist far-right groups, and I think that right now is a time where it has come to a head, and we will have a clearer and better picture once our courts have acted.
Thank you. I have a point of order. L'honorable présidente du Conseil du Trésor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, pour le rappel au règlement. Alors, Madame la Présidente, j'ai l'honneur de soumettre un message de Son Excellence, la gouverneure générale du Canada, portant sa signature. De déposer dans les 2 langues officielles le budget supplémentaire des dépenses C de 2021-2022.
Alors, j'ai l'honneur d'informer la Chambre qu'une communication doit donc... Point of order. Member for Calgary Centre.
Without interruption, government business until it's heard. Okay.
It is in order. Alors, j'ai l'honneur d'informer la Chambre qu'une communication dont voici le texte a été reçue. Son Excellence, la gouverneure générale, transmet à la Chambre des communes le budget supplémentaire des dépenses C, faisant état des fonds nécessaires au financement de l'administration publique fédérale pour l'exercice se terminant le 31 mars 2022 et conformément à l'article 54 de la loi constitutionnelle de 1867, recommande ce budget de la Chambre des communes. I have the honor to inform the House that a communication has been received as follows. Her Excellency, the Governor-General transmits to the House of Commons the supplementary estimate C of sums required to defray expenses of the federal public administration for the fiscal year ending on March 31st, 2022, and in accordance with Section 54 of the Constitution Act 1867, recommends those estimates to the House of Commons. Et l'honorable présidente a déjà déposé le document. Merci. Resuming debate, the honourable member for